Welcome to Hit the Bricks. Everything that's interesting. We'll take a drink. About Guthrie, Oklahoma. I'm ready. Our special guest today is Nathan Turner from the Oklahoma Territorial Museum. Hey, Nathan.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad you're here.
Thanks.
You know, we've had Michael from the museum
Right.
as a guest. Now you're here. At some point, Erin is going to have to come over and be a guest.
Yeah, definitely.
So-
We'll make sure she does that.
Okay, good. Nathan, there's been a lot of stuff in the news, whatever that means, recently about a fantastic book called Boomtown that a guy named Sam Anderson wrote. And I just finished reading that, and a lot of that book, most of it had to do with the land run and how it related to Oklahoma City.
Right.
There was a little bit of stuff in there about Guthrie. Some pretty interesting things about the kind of the rivalry of Guthrie and Oklahoma City as they kind of postured for whoever got to be capital of Oklahoma. So there was a little bit of Guthrie info in that book, and I highly recommend that book to anybody who's listening or watching. It's super entertaining. But when it comes to Guthrie's role in the land run, I thought it'd be fun for us to kind of talk about how, what part Guthrie played and all of that stuff. I think to start with, a lot of times when we start talking about the land run, we kind of the conversation almost sounds like up until that cannon blast or whatever it was, no one had ever been here before.
Right. Yeah, and it's totally false. But yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So kind of give us an idea of before the land run, what was Oklahoma, and who was here?
Okay. Well, of course, we had the Native American removals into the boundaries of Oklahoma, starting in the 1830s and continuing through the 1870s. But what you had for the land run was 2 million acres in the heart of what's now Oklahoma. Basically from Orlando Road on the north to Purcell on the south, and we're bounded by Kingfisher and the town of Meridian, or Indian Meridian, where that line was. Some change in that along the river, but that's in general what we're looking at. And in 1866, that land originally belonged to the Creek and Seminoles. That was taken away due to the effects of the Civil War and such. And so it was left as unassigned from that time period, and they call it unassigned because it was not assigned to a specific tribe. And we've got this vision, or this like you say, this idea in our head that these settlers came in the cannon blast and brought virgin ground that nobody had ever been here before, and it's just patently false. Really, the industry that used this area was cattlemen. There were a number of different ranches in the area. The land was used as essentially free grazing for cattlemen. The land north of us in the Cherokee Outlet was leased to cattlemen because of the grassland. Well, here you had 2 million acres of free grass.
What a deal!
What a deal! And even greater deal. There was a push to bring another tribe in. They were going to bring in the Sioux at one point, and that bill to do that got killed by a representative from Kansas and a representative from Texas, which, interestingly enough, the Texas cattlemen brought their cattle up to the unassigned lands, and they sold them in Kansas. So you've got these things that are going on. You've got this little intrigue and politics. We think politics. Today we watch it and we're going, oh, these guys are nuts. Well, they were nuts in 1872.
Oh, yeah.
So a lot of things haven't changed, but. In fact, prior to the land run happening, there were miles of fencing that the soldiers had to take out of this area. Up at Cowboy Flats, up north by on the Cimarron River. There were cowboys moving cattle out of that area prior to the land run occurring. So you had that going on. You also have, in 1887, the Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe Railroad was built through the unassigned lands. Well, you had to have railroad stops. Guthrie is a prime example. That's why Guthrie was on the map. About every 10 to 15 miles, there would be a railroad stop.
Yeah, I've seen on maps, like even places like Waterloo
Yes.
was a city.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
you know, if you're not familiar with Guthrie, just a few miles down the road is a road called Waterloo. Like originally, it was an actual city with a railroad stop, small, tiny city.
yeah.
Like, well, all of them were at the time. But yeah, it's interesting those railroad stops have kind of just disappeared over the course of 100 years.
They truly have, and you know, some of the towns that we think of now, Moore, Norman, Purcell, those were all stops on the railroad. Well, you had to have people to man those railroads, or those railroad stations. You had to have, you know, personnel in and around. There are a couple of interesting photographs. There's a book written about Oklahoma City where it talks about there were 25,000 head of cattle shipped out of the railroad station in Oklahoma City in 1888, a year prior to the land run. So we know that we have people in here and people that are moving around. David Payne's Boomer Group and Charles Carpenter and
not the meteorologist.
Not the meteorologist. Not the meteorologist. You know, was a member of the Boomers, or started the Boomer movement, and to kind of drum up for opening of the unassigned lands to settlement.
So the Boomers that you're mentioning, a lot of folks think of those folks as being, you know, when the cannon blast happened, they went and got land. But that Boomers, it means something totally different than that.
Is totally different. The term really originates from about 1850. And the idea then was, is if Justin's running for office and I'm supporting Justin, I'm going to walk through the streets banging my drum, booming.
It means you're annoying.
It's probably very, very annoying. But it's you're advocating. You're pushing for something, and that's really where the term comes from. And it gets confusing because when you look at the contemporary newspaper writings, for instance, the newspaper would say the Boomers crossed the line. So the term was used incorrectly even at that point.
So David Payne and his movement, that Boomer movement,
right?
They wanted these unassigned lands. If I get terms wrong,
no, you're fine.
Correct me. He wanted these unassigned lands opened up for settlement. Like, was it just because they wanted free land, or was there like some other, like, was there motives behind that, or?
A couple of things. It would have been under the Homestead Act of 1862, and what Payne and his movement looked at, they said, you know what, this is open land. It's not assigned to any Indian tribe. Under the laws of the United States, we ought to be able to settle it under the Homestead Act. And so there was a big push there. It was also, you know, Payne and the Boomers were very progressive. They, in fact, in their newspaper, they advocated for women's suffrage in 1880s time frame. So it's a very different political group. There were a lot of things going on at the time where, you know, farmers, you know, were against the railroad because the railroad would, you know, charge them so much to ship their grain that they didn't make anything. And so there was a lot of this political and cultural turmoil that was going on, and we still see some of it today, quite frankly. So that was part of the movement as a whole, to the point that David Payne, even when he would get arrested, the soldiers would take him out of the unassigned lands and drop him off in Kansas and then not charge him in federal court. And he kept bugging him, said, charge me. You have to charge me, because he felt very strongly that if he got in front of a judge, he would have the case that, you know, so nobody, you know, in power at that time really wanted to test it.
So him crossing that line over into Oklahoma was kind of like a protest
Yeah,
of
some
sorts?
protest march of sorts, and even to the point where they would come in and start building towns and things, and then the soldiers would come and escort them out or push them out. Interestingly enough, there are some accounts where David Payne came into the unassigned lands with a few head of cattle in front of him. The soldiers didn't bother him at all. Okay,
Interesting.
and so you had this this battle or fight between cattlemen and farmers, much like when you think of the old West, in New Mexico, get the sodbuster out kind of mentality. So you still had some of that thinking that was going on here in the unassigned lands. But then what, of course, happened, one of the big pushes of that, there was a horrible blizzard in 1887 and 1888. And it killed off, not here, it was up in the Great Plains, northern Great Plains, where a lot of cattle were killed off. And so you had the railroad that came through in 1887. You had the cattle industry no longer as strong for ratcheting to keep this land theirs.
So they were like, whatever. Our cattle are dead anyway.
Our cattle are
so,
dead. We don't care anymore. The railroad, of course, is like, hey, open that to settlement so that we can start making money. And which it's capitalism. It's what we do. And so that's when it really the final push to have that passed in 1889. Although there was legislation starting in 1879 to open it to settlement. But it just kept getting quashed.
So David Payne and the Boomers, ahead of 1889, they had made their little soirees into Oklahoma. And in Anderson's Boomtown book, he tells a story about in Oklahoma City. There were a number of folks who worked for a company called I think the Seminole Company.
Mm-hmm.
Had nothing to do with the Seminole tribe. They were just a bunch of white dudes who thought it sounded cool to call themselves a Seminole Company, and so I think they volunteered to be U.S. Marshals, just so they could show up early and pretend to be like in charge of things.
Yes.
And as soon as the cannon blast happened, they were like, oh, never mind, but we're already here. So I think the way he describes it in Oklahoma City, the people, I guess they were speculators, I think is what the official term is. So the speculators for the Seminole Company pretty much gobbled up all of the land there in Oklahoma City.
Right.
And then when everybody else showed up to kind of stake their claim there, the Seminole Company was like, that'll be, however much money. So the free land was no longer free land down there.
Well, that actually happened in Guthrie
really?
as well. We have a story, it's a biography written on a man by the name of Roy Hoffman. And his wife wrote this story about him, telling about his life, and he wound up being an incredible man. Wound up in Chandler, and he was a judge, and so on. But she tells a story that when he was 20 years old, which you had to be 21 or head of household to get land in the land room. That's under the Homestead Act. Well, he's 20 years old, and he's in Guthrie, and it's right before the land run, and he sees all these other people doing it, so he puts for sale signs on like 10 or 12 lots in downtown Guthrie. And he sold all but one of them and built the Guthrie Daily Leader building. Oh, wow. So, I mean, those types of things were occurring. But now what happened for a lot of those folks, especially U.S. Marshals and things, they were not able to keep their claim. Okay. The thought process was, look, you had an unfair advantage. You were a legal Sooner. Legally, you needed to be here to keep peace and order, etc. But you had an unfair advantage from everybody else, and so therefore, if you were the railroad station master, you couldn't walk out and claim the lot next to the railroad station, kind of thing. Nice.
So we defined the term boomer. So define the term Sooner.
Sooner, we oversimplify it, but we say those are the folks that got here a little sooner than everybody else. Some people say, well, they were cheaters. Well, okay, yeah, probably. Others, opportunists. Others, we believe that some of the Sooners may have been former Boomer members. Boomer movement members. Let's say that 12 times fast.
It's probably pretty easy to hide out in different nooks and crannies of the southern plains.
Yeah, it wouldn't be that difficult to do. I mean, there's 2 million acres is a lot. I mean, that's a lot of ground to cover. Now, there were soldiers, in here in the U.S. Marshal, trying to keep the peace and keep Sooners out. But there's an account of down at the southern border at the river across from Purcell, at 12 o'clock noon, one of the soldiers, they fired their pistols or something. And the account is he's up on watching up from high, and he can see all these people jump out of bushes and whatever, and off they go, and they're running, and they take over. But people knew where they wanted to be.
Yeah.
If you were serious about this land run and you had time, you'd probably come in here and go, oh, that's a good looking claim. I'm going to come here on that morning.
It was a funny story in the Boomtown book was whoever was kind of in charge in the Oklahoma City area, I guess it was a U.S. Marshal or a soldier, whoever, when he looked at his watch, it said, in 12 o'clock hit, it should have taken like a certain amount of time for people to get there.
Right.
And like his story is like he turned around and people were just there.
Yeah.
He's like, "Where'd you come from?"
Yeah. There were a lot of those instances of people doing. And
but it wasn't like I think sometimes the idea of the land run gets a little bit romanticized. I think there was the movie with Tom Cruise.
Yeah, Nicole Kidman.
Far and Away.
Yeah.
And it seems like this jolly kind of like they just kind of rode horseback and nothing bad happened and they just showed up and staked their claim. But like it was kind of just anarchy, right?
It was very chaotic. There, for instance, in Oklahoma City, there were competing town site companies, and in that day, if I had a town site company and I went to you and said, okay, Justin, you're a musician and this is going to be your shop, and you put your mark, that's where you pay me a little extra money to be sure you get that corner lot. Well, but then Bill over here has another competing town site. So you can imagine that chaos. And even when, a couple of days after the run in Guthrie, one of the U.S. Marshals hooked up a horse to a big log, and they went down the street and said, if you're in the way, you lost your claim, move. Because it hadn't been laid out properly. So you had people that were just everywhere, in town, and then in the country, on the 160-acre claims, the idea was, I'll backtrack. In the 1870s, survey crews came through and they laid out township and range and our system. By thought, you should have had a marker every half mile. So when we think about everything in Oklahoma, we're in a grid, and it's a mile apart. If you're from 23rd to 36th Street, that's a mile, and from May to Penn is a mile, whatever. Then you would have a marker about every half mile, because it's 640 acres, it's 160 acres for 4 quarters, and you got a quarter section. So if you had a marker every half mile, it should have been pretty easy to find out where you were in relationship to anybody else. Problem is they did this in the 1870s, and one of the tools that they used was cedar posts that were marked. Well, cedar is pretty good for burning, and termites like it, and if you're running cattle out here, they're going to rub on something because there weren't any trees. So you can imagine some of those were gone. We have stories about the cowboys that were up in the flats were taking the stone markers that they used and throwing them in the Cimarron, and just because why not?
Sure.
They're 17-year-old boys. This is what
bored.
we do. This is what they're bored.
Yeah.
We've been watching cattle all day. Now we'll go have some fun and mess
the
with people.
cowboys were basically kids.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we think of them. Oh, they had to be 30, 40 years old.
It wasn't
but a lot
John
of them-
Wayne.
No.
Yeah.
Most of your cowboys were young. Most of your soldiers were very young as well. That we've found you know, 15 to 18 years of age. I mean, they were young kids, or what we would consider young kids, and so there was a lot of issues and a lot of problems in, finding land descriptions, and we have one account we know of where a man went 3 miles in one direction and found a stake, and then had to basically extrapolate from that where he was as far as description of the land. So
there was a story. I'm gonna keep referring to Boomtown because I just read it,
Yeah.
and so I'm obsessed with it. But the first mayor of Oklahoma City, he had done something similar when he arrived. Couch was his last
Yes.
name. When he arrived, he staked his claim on the outskirts of Oklahoma City. When it was one of those larger claims. Then when he was elected mayor, he spent all his time there in the city, so he just kind of like assumed he'd get back out to his claim one of
Right.
these days. And when he finished with his mayor job, he went out there to his claim, and there were houses all over
Yeah.
it. People would just kind of like, oh, nobody's using this. And evidently, one of those folks wasn't too happy with the idea of, vacating the premises, so they shot him.
Yeah, shot and killed him.
Yeah, he shot him in the knee or the leg, but since there weren't, a bunch of hospitals or medicine or doctors around, it didn't take him long to kick the bucket.
Yeah. Yeah, and there were other cases of people that would decide that they wanted your claim, they wanted your town lot or your 160 acres, and they would get together with their friends and file a case against you and use their friends as witnesses that you were a Sooner and so on. So all those types of shenanigans happened, and my brother-in-law is an attorney, and he said, I wish people would spend as much time figuring out ways to do good than they do figuring out ways to do bad and game the system, etc. We had that same type of thing going on in 1889, 1890 that we do today.
Yeah, it really was this wild time of. Every time I read things about that time period, all I think about is the TV show Deadwood. It's just this absence of government and absence of it was rules, but people were just breaking them every single which way they could think of.
Right.
It was interesting that David Payne and the Boomers. They went I think they went so far as to actually lay out a street grid in Oklahoma City,
Right.
where they basically it's not the same street grid they have now.
Well, the Boomers, members of the Boomer movement, had their own town site committee, or town site company to lay out in Oklahoma City. So yeah, they certainly did. And one other thing too, as a member of the Boomers, you would say that my earlier example, this is where I want my shop to be, or this is where I want my farm to be when this occurs. And so that was part of your membership fee to join the Boomers. Those types of things certainly were common, very common occurrence. And then we know about Guthrie and we know about Oklahoma City, but I don't know much about what happened in Kingfisher. I don't know how they did it in Moore. I don't think Moore wasn't established as a city quite yet. Took a while for that, but in other small communities, how did they do it in Pleasant Valley? How did they do it in Mulhall? How did they? Those are some of those questions from history that are maybe not lost to history, but just haven't been explored.
So real quick, before we take a little break, the perimeters of what we're talking about.
Right.
So the folks who are waiting along the edge to, pounce on their land that they wanted to claim. So tell us again, where those people were waiting on the north, southeast, and west borders.
They were in a number of different areas. The vision that we have of the cannon going off and all the wagons taking off would have been mainly your northern border and the western border. Many of those folks massed in Caldwell, Kansas, and came across a Cherokee outlet with soldiers because they were in Native American land where they're not supposed to be, so they had to come across with an escort, and they lined them up on the northern edge, and that's where you see, the cannon and those types of things happening. It also happened near what is now El Reno, but where Fort Reno was, because the 9th and 10th Cavalry was there, so you had people there. And then at Purcell, well, Purcell would be on the south side of the river, so that would have been the southern border. We know we had soldiers there. The eastern border, not so much, and various points in between. We always tell our school kids there weren't enough soldiers to hold hands around the whole, the whole 2 million acres. And so there were a number of different trails that were already established, wagon roads and things. And so there were people amassed along that.
There's a great chapter in Boomtown where he walks from I think what is Choctaw, and so that was there's stories of people waiting there in what would become Choctaw, and so he walks from that point all the way to downtown Oklahoma City and kind of just describes what that's like. That would be like. What it's like in modern times now, and what they might have thought as they were doing that, 100 years ago.
Yeah,
pretty cool. Let's see. Last weekend we were at Red Brick Nights, and so we were super fortunate to get a couple seconds with Tanner Fields, one of the musicians from Red Brick Nights, and he recorded a song for us there. So we're going to take a quick break. Listen to Tanner play a fantastic song from the most recent Red Brick Nights. We'll be right back and talk a little bit more about the land run in Guthrie.
Hey, my name's Tanner Fields. I'm going to play one of my original songs for you guys. It's called On the Line. There's a purpose, there's a reason for every open door, in every single shattered dream. There's a diamond on the floor. To me it's now or never. I have this here chance to shine, so I will lay it out for you. Lay it all on the line. If I lay it all on the line, will my effort be worth a dime? Give me some soul side, so I don't waste my precious time in the sweet by and by. The goal may be all mine, but the only way to know is to try and lay it all on the line. If you see my spirit fade, will you fill me with your love? Will you offer up devotion, guidance from above? I'm gonna let it be what it wants to be. Gonna stand out of the way and give it my best shot, 'cause that's all I can do today. If I lay it all on the line, will my effort be worth a dime? Give me some soul side, so I don't waste my precious time in the sweet by and by. The goal may be all mine, but the only way to know is to try and lay it all on the line. give me some sort of sight, so I don't waste my precious time in the sweet by and by. The gold may be all mine, but the only way to know is to try and lay it all on the line. The only way to know is to try and lay it all on the line.
Thanks, Tanner Fields, for that fantastic song that you played for us at Red Brick Nights. The next Red Brick Nights is coming up June 1st, so mark that on your calendars to hang out in Guthrie that evening. Lots of food, music, good times, and we'll talk more about Red Brick Nights probably next week on Hit the Bricks. We're back. Nathan Turner, thanks again for being here. This is fun.
Bet. Oh yeah, always.
To totally nerd out on land run stuff.
Yeah.
One of the cool things that I stumbled onto a while back was the OU library has this archive of WPA interviews.
Yes.
And there's so many of them, and it talks about all kinds of. They just interviewed whoever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the Western History Collection, and it's the WPA project. I'm drawing a blank on specifically what it was called, but yeah, and they did it statewide, and actually did it nationally. So you have all these stories from people,
and it was what's cool about it is they were interviewing people that if they hadn't have interviewed them, these first person accounts would have been lost to history.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because they did it in the 1930s, and so these were folks that they were interviewing people who probably made the land run, or whose families made the land run, and who knew about the Bill Doolin and
Right.
contemporaries of all these these outlaws that we think about, and all the stories that happened at that time. Yeah.
One of the coolest stories that I've found in there was the hardware store owner here in Guthrie was interviewed, and one of the buildings is named after Farquharson. And so the interviewer is talking to him, and he's just describing what it was like to have the hardware store here. And it got so busy, he did so much business that he had to, he hired a young man to be like the night shift person at the hardware store. So when a train would come into town in the middle of the night, he was ready to sell them shovels and gunpowder, whatever they needed. They could buy it at 3 a.m. at the hardware store in downtown Guthrie.
Oh, that's crazy.
And he talked about how he had the hardware store in Guthrie that was well established, and when what's north of us, Perry? Yes, when Perry was starting to become a place,
right?
He decided he was going to put the young man in charge of the shop here in Guthrie, and Mr. Farquharson went up to Perry, and he tells this great story about how his hardware tent that he had there was right next to the tavern tent.
Oh, nice.
So they were just getting hammered every night next door to him, and it got so bad in terms of people shooting each other in the middle of the night that he started sleeping behind his cast iron stove as kind of like a bulletproof vest
to protect himself a little bit.
He would sleep behind the stove, and he would. I think he even talked about how he put he would sell ammunition too. So he would put the ammunition with him behind the stove, so no one could shoot into his stack of bullets and things. And,
wow.
Yeah, I thought that was
that's
hilarious.
And the fun thing about that is that those that are listening, anybody can go access that. You can go to the Western History Collection and look at the WPA stuff and just double click, and you'll read this typewritten story that's there, and it's incredible to have.
Yeah, I think if I remember right, there's some stories in there that talk about what we refer to now as the elbow.
Oh, okay.
Area, and the elbow. If I remember right, this is an area on the western side of Guthrie, and it kind of became a place when the different lots were being claimed, and if I remember the story right, a certain person had claimed most of those lots over there, and there were a lot of folks who were camping out down by the railroad track, and most of those folks, I think, were African American folks who were on their way to the Langston Township, and basically just hadn't gotten there yet. But the story I remember reading was at some point, I think in the evening time, the judge pronounced that whoever had all those lots, for some reason, didn't have legal authority to have those lots. So that all of a sudden they became available again. So all these folks who were camping out down by the railroad tracks basically just jumped across the Cottonwood Creek and formed a neighborhood. And so traditionally that neighborhood became an African American neighborhood in Guthrie. And today there are still some basically just ruins of homes over there. I think because of the continuing floods that happened for years and years.
Right. Yeah, that's essentially the federal government started buying out folks that lived there in the mid 70s through the 80s. And there were some bitter disputes about some of that, as you can imagine. But it's a floodplain, and it, as we all know, just a couple of weeks ago, it flooded like crazy, on the river, and it's just something that Guthrie's always had to deal with. But yeah, it was a predominantly African American. I wouldn't say predominantly, it was. And in through the 60s and 70s. I know that the former police chief for the city of Guthrie, Leroy Sears, and the sheriff of Logan County, and I forget his name, he happened to be an African American man, but they had a deal that if there was an issue, the sheriff would go over there and handle it. In that area, it was that divided, and of course this was in a time of obviously extreme racial divide and Jim Crow laws and those types of things. So I actually had the opportunity, it's probably been 15 years ago, myself and a couple other staff members from the museum actually went over and photographed it. And at the time, it was very obvious where the streets were. There were fire plugs. There were still some homes that were standing. Most of them were ruined, fallen down, dilapidated. But it was a little eerie. It's like life after people kind of thing. Where nature's taking over and so on. But
I hiked out there with some friends a few years ago. Not that we're advocating
don't go there
hiking out into this area. This is we're not saying this is the smart thing to do, just saying that it's been done.
That's right.
And there the ruins of there's an old church that's kind of most of it's burned down, but there are still some remnants of homes that not maybe just a couple now, I think. And there's an old city park out there with the pavilion and restrooms and the backstop of the softball field and stuff.
I seem to recall there was a swing set, just the bones of the swing set, but still out there, But
you can talk to lots of people who live in Guthrie now that have tons of memories from their childhoods out there. I think Chris Jared was telling me that they used to take their baseball photos out there every year for whatever reason. So, super interesting kind of piece of Guthrie's history. Before we go, maybe just talk about a little how after the land run, why Guthrie in terms of it becoming the capital of Oklahoma? How did it get there ahead of Oklahoma City?
Ahead of Oklahoma City, it was really it was designated to be the territorial capital, and part of that was political. Guthrie had really become just the buzzword. and for whatever reason, it had become the place people wanted to be and go.
Somebody in Washington liked us.
Or liked somebody.
Somebody's buddy.
There was somebody was a friend of somebody somewhere. And, part of, and initially we didn't know this was going to happen, but Guthrie at the time was largely a Republican city, and some would argue that it is today. Oklahoma City at the time leaned more Democrat. Now, those parties are different now than what we have today, but anyway. And so when you had your territorial governors, all but one were Republican. Although one of the first bills in the territorial legislature in 1890 was to move the capital from Guthrie to Oklahoma City. So this has been or had been a political fight for a very long time. And Guthrie certainly took advantage of that as a community. But the other thing that Oklahoma City did is they grew. Guthrie was, said born 10,000 people by, evening of April 22nd, 1889, and we're what, 14 today?
Right.
So Oklahoma City's, X million. And Oklahoma City had picked up more industry. They picked up more railroad lines, which had built their city to much larger than what Guthrie had become. But it was just the town that people wanted to be at. It was the the favorite child of someone. Bring people into here.
There's another story in the Boomtown book where he talks about how, like, leading up to that final vote that officially made Oklahoma City the capital,
right.
It kind of came down to the rival newspapers, and that the Daily Oklahoman, which was, or I think it was still already called that, but owned by E.K. Gaylord,
right.
He basically ran a better propaganda campaign than the Guthrie paper owner, and he talked about how the newspaper owner there in Oklahoma City basically disseminated this propaganda all over the state about why Oklahoma City should be the capital.
Okay.
And a lot of the things that he was saying about the reasons why were absolute it just made stuff up.
Yeah.
But he never put any of it in the actual paper. And so, according to Sam Anderson in his book, the Guthrie paper owner, since he didn't see this stuff occurring in the newspaper, he just assumed that they were kind of fighting on a level playing field. But all the while, the Daily Oklahoman owner was sharing all this propaganda all over the state, and built up, a kind of a groundswell of people across Oklahoma who thought Oklahoma City should be the capital, and.
I'm going to have to read that book.
Yeah, supposedly swayed public opinion via his kind of underground propaganda campaign.
It would not surprise me. I know that Eddie Gaylord and Frank Greer were not friends. There's a story about just
Frank Greer being
the owner of the state capitol newspaper
here in Guthrie,
and E.K. Gaylord sent people up to watch the press room because he didn't believe that Greer had as big a readership as he claimed. Well, of course, your ad rates are based on your readership,
right.
and so Gaylord really didn't think that he did, and accused him of all these nefarious things. And so it wouldn't surprise me to see that type of rivalry. And again, Frank Greer was a Republican and Gaylord was Democrat. So in that day and time, if you were a Republican, you'd buy the Daily State Capitol newspaper. If you were a Republican, you'd buy the Leader, or excuse me, I switched that. If you're a Republican, you'd buy the Capitol. If you were a Democrat, you would buy the Leader or the Daily Oklahoman or what have you. It's where we do it today. It's CNN or Fox. People watch where they are and read what they want to read. So that would not surprise me at all. The other thing, though, that I think that with Oklahoma City, the population just of Oklahoma City was so much larger. And then Shawnee was thrown into the mix as well. So there are actually 3 cities that vied for the capital.
Oh, wow.
And, now why Shawnee? I mean, it's just it's one of those questions that we have. But Guthrie fought it. The community fought that. Took it all the way to United States Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court basically said that, Oklahoma's a sovereign state. She wants to move her capital early, she can. And, we get into the whole, the seal was stolen. Dun, 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 dun. It's horrible. And in fact, the Enabling Act that allowed Oklahoma to become a state said that Guthrie would be the capital for 6 years after statehood. And then Oklahomans could vote on the permanent placement of their capital, which is why we didn't build big legislative offices. Guthrie built the convention hall, which is now attached to the Masonic Temple, but that was done with community dollars. That was not done with state dollars. And the idea from the Guthrie leaders was, look, we already have this beautiful building. There's no reason to, move to Oklahoma City. We've already got, so on and so forth. And it's why that, the state capital we have wasn't, 1917 when it was completed, so 10 years after statehood. So when they had the vote in 1910, they moved it that very night, on a Saturday night. And people think about, well, what is the seal? Well, if you've ever been to a notary public, to have anything notarized, a title, anything at the bank, and that little press seal, that's what the seal looked like. Now it was larger. It was probably about the size of a 2-liter bottle of Coke, but that's all the seal was. So
something they would stamp.
You
on
would stamp for official documents, right? Yeah. So just the removal of this piece of office equipment,
right.
From one building to another, did not move the capital.
Right.
It was the actual vote.
It wasn't some magical.
Yeah, it wasn't a magical thing. And
the skull.
Yeah,
of,
right. The crystal skull or something along those lines. Yeah, no, it was just a piece of office equipment, and we have actually a territorial seal at the museum. And again, it's larger than the state seal they alleged they have in, I think it's in Oklahoma City now, they think is the one. But, you had more than one because every office would need one to make it an official document and such.
So everything that we've talked about, mostly, if folks are interested in these kind of things, they can come to the museum, the Territorial Museum.
Right.
Your days and hours are what?
We're Tuesday through Saturday from 9 until 5.
Cool.
And
there's permanent exhibits on display people can look at. There's also your the current temporary exhibit. Is it still the women's suffrage? Is it still up?
Yeah, still over women's suffrage and political allegory of the Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, really cool stuff.
Yeah, it's good stuff. And then we also have an outdoor exhibit space that we rotate throughout the year. Right now we have African American experience in Oklahoma Territory that's up, and it chronicles some of those stories that have not been told before. So,
that's awesome. So stop by the Territorial Museum here in Guthrie. Also, if you get a chance to go online, check out the that archive of interviews there at the OU Library about from the WPA era interviews. Those are things that are just super fascinating. You can literally spend days just reading through that. Some of it's incredibly exciting. Some of it is the most boring stuff you'll ever read. They interviewed just whoever, but it's pretty cool. So Nathan, thanks again for coming by today.
You're welcome.
It's been
Thanks
a good
for
time.
having me.
Yeah, and we'll see everybody next week on Hit the Bricks.
Coming home.